In this video, we'll explore the microstructural features that operate in this second sublecture. We'll begin with those features that operate in section 1 that begins in 2513 and continues through 27.4. There are 10 microstructural features that operate in this span. The first of them involves thematic coherence across this particular section. Thematic unity creates coherence for section 1, and it suggests this title: Counsel for Courtiers, Lessons Concerning Greed and Generosity in 7 Relationships. Those 7 relationships subdivide into a first group of 4 relationships that begins in 2513 and continues through the end of the chapter, that is 2528. And then there will be a second group of relationships, 3 in number, starting in 26.1 and continuing through 27.4. Let's locate those. They would be blocks. So block 1A spans the first 4 relationships. You see it on the left side of your screen with a block title, Self-Control Concerning the Hazard of Greed in 4 relationships, with a recap, 2513 through 28. And now let's locate block 1B. That will start with chapter 26, verse 1. There we have on the left, towards the bottom, 26.1, and the first major heading that embraces that verse would then be section 1, block B, and you see the title, Shrewdness Concerning the Hazard of Generosity. That contrasts self-control regarding greed. Now it's generosity. The earlier had 4 relationships, and here you see 3 relationships will be enumerated, followed by a recap, and that spans 26.1 all the way through 27, verse 4. These 2 groups, that is, self-control regarding greed in 4 relationships and shrewdness and generosity in 3 relationships, these 2 groups correspond to the dual themes that were introduced in the Courtier Counsel embedded within the very first sublecture. There in 25 verses 6 and 7, the sage gave instruction about self-control concerning greed, surrounding the issue of self-promotion, that is, the courtier aspiring to a higher place and using strategies that did not involve integrity to get there. And then also within that introductory sublecture, there was a second courtier instruction regarding shrewdness concerning generosity when others would apply to the courtier asking for his assistance. The passage that corresponds to in the introductory self-lecture was 25 verse 8 through 10. So in the introductory self-lecture, the hazard of greed appeared in the form of lusting after prestige when interacting with relationship to one's superiors. Again, that's 25 verses 6 and 7. The first of 4 greed scenarios in the present sublecture envisions a subordinate who must choose between serving his superior with faithfulness and honesty or using deception to secure a better performance rating from his superior. This we see in Unit 1A1, which spans 2513 to 15. Here you see it beginning then on the lower left of your screen, continuing verses 13, 14, and 15. You can see that Unit 1A1 is entitled Restraining Promotion Greed toward superiors. The elements within that then are verse 13, which is titled A Dependable, Refreshing Subordinate. That encapsulates or summarizes rather the content of verse 13. That's contrasted with what we find in verse 14, where instead the sage gives us an idea of what an undependable, disappointing subordinate looks like. And that individual reminds us of what we saw in the introductory sublecture of a courtier aspiring to a higher position, presenting themselves with self-promotion grander than they really are. That reminds us what we see here in 25:14. In 25:15, a positive picture of a subordinate relationship to a superior. It's labeled a self-controlled subordinate. The second greed scenario urges self-restraint when inclined to enjoy too greedily a neighbor's hospitality. Let's display that so it's completely visible. Now you see on the left, beginning with 25:16, there is the unit title 1A2, which reads Restraining Hospitality Greed. Again, this contrasts the relationship with a superior. Now we have a different relationship. It's a relationship with a peer, more specifically a neighbor. Here the sage teaches that one must avoid gorging oneself on food. That corresponds to verse 16. One must avoid overstaying one's welcome. That corresponds to 17. And surely one must forbear deceptive treachery to gain an advantage. That corresponds to 18 and 19. Verse 20 gives us a core principle which guides proper relationship towards neighbors. And that reads, one who pulls off a garment on a cold day. This is ostensibly an act of kindness. Vinegar on soda, which in context must also represent an act of kindness or generosity. Such is one who sings songs, that would be an act of kindness, but the songs are sung to the tune of wrong motives, which tells us there is something underneath the surface which works against the ostensible generosity and is actually showing ulterior motives. So that leads us to the title for 25:20, Core Principle. Motives are essential. In all these neighbor relationships, what's crucial is to work with pure motives. In the third greed scenario, that is after relationship to superior and relationship to a neighbor, in the third greed scenario, the sage urges self-control when the opportunity arises for greed of a passive sort, that is, effecting revenge by declining to share basic food or drink with one's adversary. This is Unit 1A3, which begins in 25:21. There we see it on the lower left. 25:21 reads, if one who hates you is hungry. We're talking about a relationship now in the third case with an adversary. And you can see then the title, Restraining Revenge Greed Toward Adversaries. When we proceed to the fourth scenario, greed takes the form of callous self-preoccupation. We can see that on the right, chapter 25, verses 23 and 4. The title is offered there, Restraining Greed Evident in Stormy Behavior Toward One's Spouse. So here the sage warns of the high cost that results when a husband treats his wife with cool or stormy disregard. As we'll be explaining later, what seems to be at work in verses 23 and 4, particularly as we read these verses in the greater context where there is clearly a theme of greed. Watch for that then in 23. A north wind will give birth to rain, and an indignant face will give birth to, is implied, a sly tongue. What we're seeing here is a caution against this particular behavior, saying if you behave in manner A, it will generate result B. If you behave like a north wind, it will generate rain. If you behave with an indignant face, it will generate a response in your other person, the other person. That person will begin to respond with a sly tongue. They will not be forthcoming. They will not be candid, but they will start to work behind your back. What's not clear yet in 23 is who are the partners in this relationship. Is it a subordinate superior? Is it peer-to-peer, the neighbor? Or is it the offended party to an enemy, an adversary? It's none of those, and we learn the relationship in verse 24. It is better, the sage goes on, to live on the corner of a roof than with a woman disposed to contention and a shared house. So now we see that this fourth relationship is the spouse relationship, husband to wife. When we bring that into verse 23, we can see that the husband would correspond to the north wind, if he so chooses. And if he comes home to his wife acting like the cold north wind, that's going to give birth to rain. It probably means it's going to bring tears to his wife. Again, if he comes in with an indignant face, he comes in with an anger management problem, that's going to drive her into subterfuge. She's going to begin to use sly tactics to navigate her relationship. Not a pretty picture. Please notice it's predicated on how the husband chooses to respond. Will he respond with what I'm calling greed that takes the form of callous preoccupation? He's not thinking about her, he just thinks about himself. He's had a bad day, he takes it out on her. That's why we say, here the sage is warning of the high cost that results when a husband chooses to treat his wife with cool, that's the north wind, or stormy, that's indignant, stormy disregard. Where that will leave him is not enjoying a shared house because there'll be too much contention. Instead, he will find he prefers to be up on the roof, which is a solitary and uncomfortable existence. I trust you're noticing through this style of reading that we're seeing in these marriage statements, the fault is not with the woman disposed to contention. Rather, she is a casualty. Her behavior is a casualty and consequence of how the husband has chosen to behave in greedy fashion, going with the overarching theme. So the sage teaches this to the pupil, advising him to choose not to respond to his spouse in that manner. Before transitioning from greed warnings in 25 verses 13 to 24 to the generosity warnings that will begin in 26:1, the sage inserts a recap. This begins in 25 verse 25 and extends through verse 28. Let's arrange the screen so that we can see this. There we have it on the left. Unit 1A5. The first cumulative recap spans verses 25 to 28. And you see that's divided into two groups. First, verses 25 and 6 that give a positive and negative recap, and then verses 27 and 8 that issue an overarching principle. Notice in particular that overarching principle. So in 27, to eat a large quantity of honey is not good, but to search out their glory is glory. So greedy indulgence must be restrained. And then verse 28, a city which has been breached has no wall. Such is a person who has no restraint over his spirit. The sage is teaching that to combat greed in the 4 preceding scenarios will require, above all, self-control. Absent such self-control, his life is as secure as a city whose wall is broken down and useless, an open invitation to any marauding bands that may be passing by. In the second group of relationships that begins in 26:1, the sage counsels the courtier to exercise caution when others appeal to his sense of generosity. Let's set this up so that it appears beginning on the left screen. There we have it. You can see the title, again, as noted earlier, Shrewdness Concerning the Hazard of Generosity in 3 Relationships, with a recap beginning in 26:1. Now, thinking back to the introductory sublecture, the hazard associated with generosity emerged as others appealed to the courtier's sense of compassion, appealing to him in hopes that he would lend his endorsement or advocacy to their litigation. There, the sage warned that if the pupil were to lend aid prematurely, without first taking time to see whether that person's complaint was actually legitimate, such liberal advocacy he would come to regret. Again, in the introductory sublecture, that shows up in chapter 25, verses 8 through 10. Now, in this present sublecture, the sage will describe 3 types of individuals who may play on the courtier's sense of generosity. They are these. First, the patently stupid fellow, and that individual is introduced in 26:1 and continues through verse 12. You can see it on the left. Unit 1B1 is labeled the patently stupid, spans 26:1 to 12. That'll continue through the right side of the screen. Continues through the left side of the screen and halfway through the right through 26:12. And notice next then we have Unit 2, the incurably lazy, beginning in 26:13 and continuing through verse 16. The top of the page is the close of the incurably lazy. And then comes the third unit, the third character in these series of relationships, the seductively litigious, beginning in 26:17, continuing through verse 28. You see that finishing at the top of the right side of your screen, 26:28. And that brings us to Unit 4 in this block, which is yet another cumulative recap. Concerning the seductively litigious fellow, we should note that it is the sage's description of this character, with his schemes of enlisting the support of the courtier or reaching out appealing for advocacy by the courtier. It is this third character in the current trio which produces the clearest overlap with what we were led to expect back in the introductory sublecture, where we encountered caution against indiscriminate generosity in the form of advocacy. So to summarize that once again, when we come to the third character here in this block, the seductively litigious fellow, he's the one with the clearest parallel to what we anticipated based on the dual theme back in the introductory sublecture. So then, based on that foundational linkage between the introductory sublecture and this seductively litigious fellow, then the implications of this advocacy relationship grow apparent with the other two characters in this block as well. We can look through that lens and view the patently stupid fellow of Unit 1B1. And looking through that lens, we can view the incurably lazy fellow of 1B2. And we realize that those also fit as individuals who are reaching out to the courtier, asking for his help, his advocacy, his generosity, his compassion. And the sage cautions against that sort of indiscriminate generosity. What we'll do next then is look more closely at those three and trace the theme of advocacy caution in those three characters. We'll begin at that point in the next video.